Leaders from global military and defense departments, head of international organizations, and renowned experts are gathering in Beijing for the 11th Beijing Xiangshan Forum, with discussions centered around global security and defense issues. The evolving nature of U.S.-China relations is, of course, a key focus. During a meeting with the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in August, Chinese President Xi Jinping said the two countries need to first and foremost find a good answer to the overarching question: are China and the United States rivals or partners? Clearly, the answer from China is partners, but the U.S. seems to have made up its mind about China being a rival. Without a consensus, where is the relationship heading? What can be done to make sure things don't spiral out of control? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from the venue of the 11th Beijing Xiangshan Forum. Let's hear the conversation. I'm pleased to be joined here on site by Xinbo, Professor and Dean of the Institute of International Studies at Fudan University, and Rick Waters, Managing Director of Eurasia Group's China practice, previously Assistant Secretary of State and Head of the Office of China Coordination in the Biden administration. The warmest welcome, and thank you to being on the Point. And of course, we have a packed house today with all the participants to the forum. Thank you very much for being with us today. Without much ado, let's go to the very important question. So President Xi says the most important thing, the first and foremost, is to define, to have the strategic perception of rivals and or partners. For China, this is first and foremost. Mr. Waters, for the United States, is it? If not, what is the first and foremost in this relationship?
Well, first off, thank you. It's great to be here. It's good to see that U.S.-China relations attracts no interest from anyone.
Sorry?
It's a very popular panel today. I think we need to think a little bit about the framing of your question. I think it's an important issue in the U.S.-China relationship. I think for most U.S. officials, for many U.S. academics, there's a different framework that we often use, and it starts less with the principles, and it starts more with specific policies. And so I think part of the challenge of saying that you have to have a correct perception is that even in the way the two countries think about the relationship, they use different frameworks for the discussion. So for the U.S., I think there is a framework, and that framework has evolved over the past several decades, and I think the newer framework is more or less set. It's a primarily competitive relationship, but I think we have to keep in perspective what that means. Competition is not always zero-sum.
Is competitiveness and rivalry the same thing in the United States' mind?
Well, I think there are aspects of the relationship that are more adversarial. There are aspects that are competitive, and there are aspects where we have to, again, maintain perspective about the reality that no matter where U.S. and China relations are, the two countries have to find a way to work together on issues of global concern. So I think that's the framework that the current administration, and I think to some degree recent administrations have used in thinking about U.S.-China ties today.
And Mr. Wu, why is China believing the right perception is the starting point of everything?
Well, I think the point here is that the way you define this relationship determines the approach you take to this relationship. If you define this relationship as more of a partner than rivalry or competitor, and then you are going to take a more cooperative approach to this relationship rather than a competitive or confrontation approach. So that is one reason why it is important. Secondly, even though the U.S. say, competition is the nature of this relationship, So competitive approach is necessary to China-U.S. relations. But from a Chinese perspective, competition is just a useful, let me put it this way, useful reason for containment and suppression. So when the U.S. uses the word compete, it goes far beyond that. If you look at the U.S. trade war, tech war, the U.S. sanctions on thousands of Chinese entities, look at the U.S. military activities around China, that's far more than competition. So why? Because I think for the U.S. policy elite, the definition of China is more than a competitor, a rival. Sometimes it's an adversary and even enemy. So that's the problem. That is why perception matters a lot.
That certainly is China's perception. And Mr. Waters, does Washington understand the Chinese perception that we just don't see how you can say a lot of things like don't seek to contain China, don't seek to provoke, to support our independence, for instance, and you're doing a whole host of things which will reinforce China's perception that this is precisely what you're seeking?
Well, I think that Washington officials, scholars who come and go, do have a fairly clear understanding of the Chinese view of these issues. But I think that's why I get back to the difference between viewing issues through the prism of perception and through specific policies. Because when you look at issues, for example, in this region, the U.S. and China have had a long-standing difference over the Taiwan issue, and yet the existing frameworks, as unsatisfying as they are, have actually, if we look at them objectively, given us 5 decades of an unhappy peace and stability. And so sometimes the reality is that these issues have to be managed in terms of looking at the specific policy actions and their implications, not just perception alone.
I understand. I think there is a big cultural, even civilizational difference here. And Mr. Waters, you speak Chinese very well. I'm sure you understand. For the Chinese, we say 家和万事兴, 和气生财. The atmosphere is like the water that's carrying everything. When the atmosphere is good, then everybody rises. But when the atmosphere is not right, then you cannot tackle the single issues and still hope this relationship to be long-term and sustainable. And I think that's what China is saying. But the United States seem not to agree to look at things this way. And you want to tackle specific issues, right?
Well, you probably have to do a bit of both, but I think my rusty Chinese, if I remember correctly, there's a saying, 听其言, 观其行.
You know that, Mr. Wu, sorry, the Chinese are saying this about the United States.
I also know English phrasing is talk the talk and walk the walk, right? I know President Biden has repeatedly reassured President Xi that the U.S. has no intention to support Taiwan independence, no intention to suppress China's development, blah, 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 blah. But if you look at the U.S. policy, it's quite a different story. So you talk the talk, but you walk a different walk. That's the problem.
You want to react?
Well, we can spend a lot of time on the Taiwan question. Professor Wu and I have had good discussions over the years. But look, let's talk about that for a second. I think that from the U.S. perspective, the policy towards the Taiwan issue is rooted in several foundational documents, the 3 joint communiques, the 1982 Taiwan Relations Act, and a series of assurances between the U.S. and Taiwan, as well as classified documents that were more recently declassified. And if you look at this as a body of policy, that framework has not changed. But what has changed in recent years, perhaps, is the evolution of politics on the island. What has changed in recent years are different perceptions between Beijing and Taipei. And I think between Beijing, Taipei, and Washington, what tends to happen on this issue is when they are acting completely at odds with each other, things can become unstable. But the core U.S. interest here, which is enshrined in all of those documents and legislation, is ultimately peace and stability. It is not to use Taiwan as an instrument of leverage in strategic competition. And this is why I think, President Biden has been very clear in his meetings that the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence, and that this is not a chip, a bargaining chip. The last thing I will say, though, is that in any government, you have inherent tensions between different aspects of your policy. And since the 1970s, the U.S. has also had an unofficial relationship with Taiwan that's a very robust one. The bilateral trading relationship alone is bigger than U.S. trade with India. So we have to keep in mind that there will be a very robust relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan that operates largely independent of the questions of U.S. cross-strait policy.
Well, I think the most important and foundational understanding between China and U.S. on the Taiwan issue is the 3 communiques between our 2 countries. That's the Shanghai Communique, Normalization Communique, and August 17 Communique of 1982. And all the 3 documents stipulate that 2 things are important in this understanding: one China and peaceful solution of the issue. So that's something the 2 governments worked out over the years. And for some time, Washington supported this position. But what we have seen in recent years, in the last 1 decade or so, is that the U.S. is becoming less sympathetic to the Chinese goal of peaceful reunification. At least many people in the U.S. would like to say the status quo continue, which means a de facto separation of 2 sides of the Taiwan Strait. And secondly, also more and more people in the U.S. strategic community is rediscovering the value of Taiwan in U.S. regional strategy to China, Indo-Pacific strategy to China. They think they can use Taiwan as an important instrument, leverage, to check and constrain China's growing influence in this region. So in that sense, that makes China feel that U.S. is no longer commit to the one China policy, and the U.S. is more and more encouraging Taiwan independence, either overtly or covertly. And also the U.S. is playing the card of Taiwan more and more against China in bilateral interactions. And as a result, China has to take actions to deal with this new reality. Yeah. So in international relations, you always have the action and reaction, this phenomenon.
Yeah, I think this question has been discussed so much, and so many times both sides have reiterated their stance, and yet things are going and have been developing. I wouldn't say to a tipping point, but seems to be going in the wrong direction. What can both sides do? I'm going to ask this question to contain the worsening or to reverse the worsening trend, because Sullivan talks about wanting to see stability, wanting to be peacefulness at the Strait. China definitely wants peace. What can the two sides do?
Well, I think in a way, if we look at the last 2 years, there has been some modest progress. And what I mean by that is that I actually think the tensions between the U.S. and China over this issue peaked in 2022, around the time of former Speaker Pelosi's visit. And my sense, and again, I'm not speaking in an official capacity, but as an analyst, is that I think both sides realized things got a bit out of hand. They realized that if the U.S. and China are going to have conflict, it shouldn't be unintentional. And I think that was part of the dynamic that led to the Bali summit, which was the initial effort to build a floor between the two sides on some of these very sensitive issues. And that effort, as we know, it got interrupted in the spring of 2023 over the balloon incident. But eventually it started to gain traction slowly through the hard work of diplomacy, through senior level visits, Secretary Blinken, Secretary Yellen, and others. And by the time you got to the Woodside Summit last year, you had, among other things, the emergence of what the Chinese side calls a strategic channel between Jake Sullivan and Director Wang Yi. And what is that channel doing? It's not changing either side's general approach, but what it is doing, I think, is trying to better communicate the actual intentions, trying to inject a measure of predictability. Because if you look back to the Taiwan elections in January, there were, and Jake has spoken publicly about this, there were some loose coordination on aspects of issues between the three major capitals, and elections in Taiwan came and went without major PLA activities and the like. So, this may sound unsatisfying, and it doesn't address the strategic concerns, but I think sometimes it's the modest but hard work of diplomacy that can at least achieve stabilization or predictability in some of these difficult areas between the two countries.
Mr. Wu, can these diplomatic steps alleviate the situation?
Well, I think there's something more than that that should be done. Taiwan issue is not a small issue. It's not a tactical issue. It requires political wisdom and strategic judgment. Just like, when Nixon and Kissinger reached out to China, we negotiated for the One China agreement. So that was a political decision, that was a strategic decision. And today, we need, once again, this kind of decision. So I would say 3 steps should be taken in moving in the right direction. First, let's close the door for Taiwan independence. Taiwan independence is just a dead end. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen at all, right? So if it tries, it's going to be disastrous for all sides. So foreclose the option for Taiwan independence. Second step is that how all the sides, Beijing, Washington, and even Taipei, can work to create an environment that's favorable to the ultimate peaceful reunification. So that's something actually in the 1980s, I think the 3 sides thought about this very seriously for a while. Today, we should come back to this trajectory. Okay, how we can facilitate the process of peaceful reunification. The third step is that finally, it takes the 2 sides of Taiwan Strait to sit down for negotiation. Okay, and U.S. is not going to be at the negotiating table. But of course, the U.S. is very important in shaping an environment that's conducive to the ultimate peaceful reunification. So I think we need this kind of political and strategic decision, and then we can reverse the current negative trend in the Taiwan Strait. What worries me most at the moment is that all the 3 sides today are making preparation for the worst case scenario. That's very dangerous. So how can we reverse this negative momentum and try to once again put this issue on the right track? That's a challenge for us.
I guess that's why the presence of Mr. Waters is particularly important here, because you are showing that there are people in the United States who care about this relationship, who want to be in China and talk to us and explain, help us understand exactly what's on the mind of the U.S. policymakers. I do want to mention this because just a couple of days ago, when the U.S. lawmakers came back from their summer holidays, they celebrated the China Week. I mean it in a sarcastic way, of course. I'm sure you've read the news. At least 21 to 22 bills directly targeting China were tabled and passed, I believe, at the House of Representatives. A busy week, yeah, and very productive week for U.S. lawmakers. A crazy week, okay. Busy, crazy. Of course, not very happy on the Chinese end. How should we understand that? How damaging is it going to be U.S.-China relationship? This is not the White House. We make the distinction. These are the lawmakers and mostly Republicans who tabled these bills, but Democrats went along and passed these bills.
Well, I think we have to look at the underlying concerns. You remember the House of Representatives, which is the closest in U.S. democracy to the American people, they tend to reflect the concerns that have been growing in several areas. Security issues are one, and we'll talk about that today. But I think for most ordinary Americans, it centers more around issues that touch their lives. And I think that would break out into two broad things. One is the reality that for many parts of the U.S. over the past 20 years, a combination of the China shock, China's entry into the WTO, automation, and other factors have decimated parts of the traditional U.S. manufacturing base. You also have the scourge of fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid that is very difficult to control because the precursors are produced in small quantities, and unlike cocaine, can be shipped into the U.S. in small batches, but at devastating effect. And it's very difficult to underestimate the impact of these trends in U.S. politics. So when you come back to China Week, when the House formed its select committee, which does, I think, represent a broad bipartisan consensus about the challenges in many of these areas, security, economics, and society, including domestic influence questions, that has started to lead to legislation meant to address many of these issues. Now, I'll say, Congress, especially the House, passes a lot of things that never actually find their way into formal legislation. But I do think that some of what we will see, some of what we have seen eventually will. And those could include things like reducing the de minimis level of goods that can come into the U.S. without tariffs, because that loophole has created a whole economy of circumvention of the market access barriers that existed in the past. I think you're going to see more adjustments of technology controls that reflect national security concerns, particularly in areas such as biotech. So I do think more is coming, but I think that is still different in my view from a decoupling, because today as we sit here, the U.S. and China still have a $575 billion bilateral trading relationship. It will shrink, but it won't disappear.
You were talking about, the bill supposedly reflecting the aspirations of the constituencies of the voters, but some of these bills are like drones, biotechnology. What are the average American gals and pals? How much are they affected by high-end Chinese drones? And that's why China is not very happy about it, first of all. And secondly, do these lawmakers really believe in the security threats these technologies may pose?
Well, I think many of them do, but I think we have to be objective about this. I mean, so do many people here. The fundamental concerns about data security are present in both countries. I mean, in some ways, I think the data security regimes developed more quickly in China than they did in the U.S. And so, I think that does matter to ordinary Americans in the sense that debates about TikTok and the algorithm, debates about privacy do
Even
resonate.
U.S. presidential candidates are using TikTok. Certainly they're not concerned about data security there.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that the policy is entirely coherent. I mean, part of the beauty and the messiness of democracy is that you will go through these debates about how do you balance questions of security with openness, with First Amendment rights to free speech. And there are no easy answers, which is why I think a lot of these bills will emerge, they may be voted on, but they may never pass into law. But I do think they're reflective of these core underlying concerns that I've outlined in the broader U.S.-China debate.
Mr. Wu, what will be the effect of such bills and such China Week sensation among the Chinese general public and industries?
Well, you just mentioned that these congressmen, their behaviors do not necessarily represent the White House, right? Well, I think you're trying to make a distinction without much difference, in my opinion. Because why, I mean, Congress, they are not necessarily self-mobilized on China. Of course, senators, congressmen, they have their own political agenda. But at the same time, they also look at what the president says, what the Secretary of State says about China. So when the president and the Secretary of State go out in public and say China is America's primary strategic competitor, China is America's most serious geopolitical challenger, and we got to, we ought to outcompete China. We need to, restrict the investment in China and also Chinese investment in the U.S. What kind of message are you sending to Congress? So in that sense, I think the executive branch really shapes the environment in which Congress thinks about their China agenda. So that's one point I want to make. Secondly, what will be impact on Chinese public? Well, we all have the impression that U.S. Congress is more often than not a major troublemaker when it comes to China-U.S. relations. I mean, look at the facts since 1979, starting with the Taiwan Relations Act, right? I mean, they played some useful roles sometimes, but to be fair, overall, Congress has been more negative than positive on relations with China, maybe largely because of their own narrowly defined political agenda back at home. But still, I recall in 1990s when the Clinton administration advocated for the policy of strategic engagement with China. Many Congress people come to visit China. I used to escort about 20 senators and congressmen for 1 week trip to China. They visit Shanghai, Beijing, taken to the Yangtze River to visit Three Gorges project. So that was how the executive branch can shape the agenda, the China agenda for the Congress. Today, people think, Congress is the most vocal and hostile voice against China in the United States. They are not only passing a lot of bills against China, which come into law later on, but also they are poisoning the atmosphere for China-U.S. relations. And also, it's fair to say sometimes they even exert pressure on the executive branch, not allowing the Biden administration to engage with China, not to stabilize relations with China. In their opinion, that's appeasing. So in that sense, Congress today is very much a liability to a good China-U.S. relationship.
Well, important thing is what will take for things to change, at least for the lawmakers? I mean, what do they care about? For instance, jobs, for instance, benefits from trading with China. There has been tremendous benefit from trading with China, while China benefited as well. What are they looking for?
Well, I think in a nutshell, it's changes in aspects of Chinese policy. And I go back to something that Professor Wu said. I agree with you that when members of Congress have come to China, that has sometimes had a very constructive effect. And let's look at the issue of fentanyl. Senator Chuck Schumer came here recently on a bipartisan delegation, met with the leadership. They had constructive exchanges behind closed doors about U.S. concerns. And I think that visit and the discussions with the leadership here and the subsequent resumption of coordination between Chinese law enforcement and U.S. drug agencies has played a stabilizing role on that issue. I could imagine a world in which, had that not happened, there would have been voices in Congress who were looking to sanction Chinese entities, or perhaps even the law enforcement structures themselves. And yet we ended up with a very different outcome. And so I think it goes back to this question of, yes, the perceptions are important. And I'm here partly because I think it's important for all of us to listen to these concerns about perceptions. But ultimately, I think what members of Congress are looking for is changes in specific policy.
China has made it very clear and repeatedly its position, its consistent position. And I'm going to quote President Xi of what he said to Mr. Sullivan during his meeting in August 29th. And if you check the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website of this particular report, you'll find it very interesting, the picture that's put there. You don't see that picture very often. President Xi's smiling, and Jake Sullivan is pulling a very, I would say, neutral face. You know, that picture says a lot, I think, about what China wants to send to the world through this picture and through this meeting. And in that meeting, President Xi reiterated 4 points that are unchanged in China's U.S. policy. Number one, China's commitment to the goal of a stable, healthy, sustainable relationship. Number two, the principle of handling this relationship based on mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. Number three, its position on firmly safeguarding the country's sovereignty, security, and development interests. Number four, its efforts to carry forward the traditional friendship between the peoples of the two countries. So what does President Xi want to tell the American people and the world by highlighting the four unchanged? And in such order, you know, China's commitment to the goal of a stable, healthy, sustainable relationship remains unchanged. What else needs to be said to persuade, to tell the American people and politicians that we are sincere, that we want this relationship to work?
Well, I don't think that the current administration has ever doubted President Xi's sincerity. In fact, I think for President Biden, who is the American who has spent more time with him than anyone else, they got to know each other when they were vice presidents. They spent time together in parts of the country just to know each other as people. I don't have any doubt about that. I think I'll leave it to Chinese officials to characterize what the intent of those messages is, but I did want to capture one important point that we haven't talked about yet. There are very consequential policy differences between the two sides. But in many areas, these have been manageable in part because the connections between the two societies were robust. And I worry a lot about what has happened since the period of COVID and beyond, the collapse in connection between the societies. I mean, in the last decade, typically 15,000 American students would come here every year. Now the number is under 1,000. And the reasons for this are complex and not entirely political. But I think the fourth point is an important one, and actually a very important part of the Woodside consensus, that it takes an active effort to keep the societies connected. Otherwise, if you lose that piece, it complicates everything else.
Mr. Wu, you used to have American teachers in your classroom. What is the situation now if we talk about people-to-people exchange?
Well, this semester on our campus, Fudan University, we have several thousand international students returning to campus, coming from Asia, Europe, Africa, but still very few from the United States. So that's not because of Chinese policy, because our policy towards international students are the same. So Asian students, European students, African students are coming back. Why the American students are slow to come back? Just look at the State Department travel a lot regarding China, right? China is still dangerous for you guys to travel to. I talked to the American students. If they want to come to China, their overseas student office will tell them, look at the travel a lot on State Department website. You should not go. You should go to Japan. You should go to South Korea. And also their parents feel nervous. I think the problem is that the current US administration and its policy actually does not encourage the resumption of people-to-people exchanges in spite of what they said in rhetoric. So that's a problem. And actually, I think the American universities, they have been working very hard to pressure the State Department to adjust its policy. But it's not working well. It's not working well. Let me go back to your earlier question about President Xi's message to the US. I think this delivers two important messages. Is that A, China's position on relation with the US has not changed. We still prefer a cooperative, stable, mutually beneficiary relationship with the United States. Two, this relationship should be principled. Our policy toward the US should be principled. We have some important principle for this relationship dating back to the Shanghai Communique when it comes to the Taiwan issue. So we are not going to compromise our major principles, our major interests for the sake of China-U.S. relations. I think these are two important messages. Now, for the U.S., I think the U.S. has not been consistent in relations with China, especially since the Trump administration. They changed their mind about what kind of relationship they want to have with China. Secondly, as the U.S. is defining China more and more as a strategic rivalry, they are actually undermining, challenging, damaging Chinese interests in economic, technological, financial, geopolitical, and security areas. So that's a problem for this relationship.
Mr. Waters, you want to react? I know you don't speak on behalf of the U.S. government, but if you want to react, you are perfectly welcome to do that. Otherwise, China has actually sent the message, and I understand that through the four unchanged, China welcomes a good relationship with the United States. And a good relationship with the United States is based on a United States that's successful as well. That's my understanding.
Well, I think that's a good aspirational goal. But again, the challenge comes back to practical policies. And I would say, I would focus on 2 points. One is, in this region, seen from the US, but not just the US, from Tokyo, from Seoul, from Manila, people are watching the greatest military buildup in history, the world's largest navy, the world's largest Coast Guard, the expansion of a nuclear arsenal with a lack of transparency that leads to questions about intent. And so it's understandable at a certain level why the specific actions related to the buildup of the PLA and its modernization are creating fears in other capitals. And this is leading to two broad dynamics. It's leading them to seek greater security between each other and to repurpose aspects of their traditional alliances with the US as a hedge. And so I think that the realities, as I see in this region, are very complicated, and it goes beyond intentions to misperception and effect. The second thing is that, again, for most political officials I have worked for, What they care about is what matters to their ordinary voters. And we are also seeing at the same time an historic level of imbalance in the Chinese economy, with savings that have nowhere to go except productive capacity. That productive capacity is now spilling across borders at a scale that is far different than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And the result is that protectionism, market access is on the rise, and the trading structures, the security structures are weakening. And so I think that we have to remind ourselves of those realities as we think about how to move towards the aspirational framings that we've talked about here.
Okay, now we've come to the economic and trade relationship. I understand you're talking about overcapacity and so on and so forth.
I avoided the word, did you see that?
I know, but you meant it, and I picked it up. Mr. Wu.
I want to take a different look at the situation in regional security. I mean, if you compare China with the U.S., China since late 1970s has not been involved in any major military conflict with any of our neighbors. So this is a major power that has not been involved in a military conflict or in a war for many decades, while at the same time its national capability has achieved historically unprecedented growth. That is quite rare in human history. So that tells China's intention. That means China really wants to have a peaceful environment in which it can continue to develop and prosper. So that's the intention. This intention is very clear. It's very clear. Same time, if you look at the U.S. record in the last 4 decades, how many wars the U.S. has been involved in all parts of the world, right? Iraq, Afghanistan, Middle East, I mean, everywhere. So how can you tell me that U.S., with this kind of record, you just come to this region and work for peace for the region? I just don't believe it. I mean, the facts don't, buy this logic. The reason why China has to build up its military capability, A, because we are confronting a very complicated security environment. Look at the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, East China Sea. Since the U.S. rebalanced to Asia strategy, we know what the U.S. has been doing in this region. So we need to develop the capability to deal with a growingly complicated security environment. And then secondly, because of our economic growth, we have more capability. We have more resources to devote than in the past. That's another reason. Above all, I think whether or not a country wants peace or not is not because of its capability, but because of its intention. I think China's intention remains to seek for a peaceful environment in which China can continue to develop and rise. I believe that. Okay.
And probably benefit as well. We definitely benefit from this relationship. But following up on Mr. Wu's comment, they're saying that, well, the United States has been bringing wars everywhere. China, this region is by and large peaceful. There's more to celebrate than there is to be worried about, as our previous distinguished speakers just put it. Does it mean that China wants the United States hands off in the Asia Pacific?
The U.S. has been a dominant actor in Asia Pacific since the end of World War II. So like it or not, that is the reality. That's the starting point when we look at the regional geopolitical situation. So China is not that naive that we hope that one day when we get up in the morning and American soldiers are gone, American military bases in this region are closed. That's not going to happen. We want to see the U.S. to stay in this region to play a constructive and peaceful role for this region, not impose its own narrowly defined security agenda on this region. And the problem is now, as we can tell, the U.S. in this region, they want to pursue a security agenda featured with containing China or politely competing with China. That is why the U.S. allies and partners in this region have been mobilized. They joined the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy to deal with China. That's something China does not like to see it happen. That's something China has to deal with it, like or not. Yeah.
Mr. Water, you want to wrap up there and while responding to that, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, essentially what we're talking about, though, is a very different view of the risks of conflict and the rules in this region. I mean, we haven't really talked about some of the actual points of friction beyond Taiwan, but, you know, I think for the U.S., these alliance relationships that predate the period of strategic competition, part of the reason that the U.S. is concerned about Chinese actions in the region is a very different view of the rules. And the previous panel talked a bit about the situation in the South China Sea, where under any definition of UNCLOS, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea.
Don't mention that because the United States is not party to it.
You are right, and I'll be the first to admit that. The U.S. has selectively embraced these rules over the years, but the reality is that if we choose not to go by UNCLOS, what is the alternative set of rules? Because if UNCLOS is the accepted rule book, low tide elevations don't generate territorial entitlements, and therefore they can't form the basis of any country's sovereign claims. And that's, I think, why the U.S. view generally tends to focus on concerns about China changing aspects of this international rules-based order. You are absolutely right. We tend to not be introspective about when we ourselves have failed to do that, but I'm not sure that it moves us closer to responsible management of these issues to simply dig in on our respective positions all the time. We have to view each side's position and try to understand why the intentions are as they are.
Mr. Wu, wrap up 1 minute, please.
Well, I think the South China Sea dispute has been there for decades and is likely to be there for several decades in the future. And at the end of the day, it's up to China and other direct disputants, claimants, to negotiate for a peaceful settlement of this issue. And before that, we need to find a way to manage the situation, not allow this issue to, break up. And in this process, the role the U.S. can play, as I can say today, the so-called the U.S. military's freedom of navigation action doesn't help at all in solving the problem or managing the problem. So in that sense, I think the most important thing for the U.S. to do is to stay out of this issue and encourage all sides to cool down, to negotiate, to compromise. So that's my ending point.
Thank you so much. We're going to wrap up there. I believe this conversation can go on and on for hours because for every issue there is so much to talk about. I would, a warm round of applause to my distinguished panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an insightful conversation. And my take, if that is worth anything, is when the water rises, every boat rises. When the atmosphere is better, it's better to talk about and maybe sort out any issue, if at all. Many thanks once again to Xinbo, Professor and Dean of the Institute of International Studies at Fudan University, and Rick Waters, Managing Director of Eurasia Group's China practice. And that's it for this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for joining us. You've got the point.